Michelle?
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose, and
Rose?
today we thought we'd talk about intellectually transmitted diseases and conceptions and how there are interesting parallels between those and kind of, we talk all the time about how without philosophy of self-defense there's a lot of trouble and you end up in a lot of issues, but is it really the case that thinking and ideas and the lack of them really causes so much issues and that it really spreads? So we kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think too it's interesting to make to flesh out such an analogy because it's so vivid and like there's a vividness to the fact that violation can happen on a physical level, but we forget that violation can happen on that intellectual level,
Yeah,
or
sure.
the mental level. And if you kind of could see how those things relate, people may be a bit more mindful about their minds, right?
Sure.
Like what they end up letting their minds get usurped by.
Yeah.
Whether that's, consumptive ingestion of certain things or, you can't always control what you hear, but it's about like what you let enter and what you kind of let, get mulled over.
Yeah.
And also those things, like it's inherent that that's going to, like we're going to hear things we don't anticipate, and it's not to become more fragile, it's to become more anti-fragile in the sense that you kind of understand some ways of being, again, more mindful with what you are allowing to enter into your mind. On a penetrative level.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I think it's interesting to think about, STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and then kind of intellectually transmitted diseases. Because often there is the idea that, like, ideas birth, ideas conceive and different things. Mm-hmm. But also sometimes, like, well, we don't want to, it doesn't seem like bad ideas or these things that are dangerous. It's not like they birth. It's more like they infect. And so there is a distinction here. And I think the lack, just kind of too much over, I guess, indexing the association of ideas and birthing doesn't do enough to talk about the negative side of it, maybe.
Yeah.
It also associates birth with something negative, which is a problem. But really it seems like when we talk about self-defense in philosophies, mainly it's almost like to protect yourself from, sexually transmitted diseases, quote unquote, ITDs, precisely so that the environment of conception and birth is protected, right? Like, you're preserving yourself from these transmitted diseases or these things that, like, the lack of logic or anxiety or mental illness, etc., so forth, precisely to protect your mind, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of talk today about attention, how algorithms take your attention, and there's an idea of be smart about your media diet, right? Well, in a way, that's a language of STDs. That's a language of there's these intellectually transmitted diseases. There are these ideas that you get infected and then you don't have attention anymore. And it's really hard to get back. In fact, it could be with you forever. It could be a permanent kind of damage, right? And so there's this new... It is kind of like, I mean, we have the language of mental illness, we have the language of emotional damage, trauma, and different things. But I do wonder if there's a metaphoric frame that's kind of missing, where it's more like ITDs, intellectually transmitted diseases that go around and infect people, but they also seem different from people say, well, that's just kind of the metaphor of a virus, right? Well, there does seem to be differences between viruses and STDs because of the penetrative. There's a certain intimacy, there's a certain letting in, there's a certain, even you can get an STD between two people that are very friendly. It's not that they're necessarily enemies, right?
Sure. It's not inherently like a violent thing. Like,
no,
it can come out of just only it could come from things that are particularly even pleasurable, but then you don't realize the kind of inherent punishment that it's also bringing upon you.
Yes, the cost.
Like the cost, the cost, and that's the thing. It's just like this came up at our Parallax talk,
yeah.
Which was great to be able to be there with Andrew Sweeney and the group there for the poetry salon, where you can actually punish with pleasure. Of course, that's the idea of soma, etc. But there's a way in which that's the whole point. The difficulty with it is that it can come because you feel like you're doing the most expressive thing or the most, like it feels the best or whatever. And yet it can leave somebody with a latent issue. And that's why I think we're kind of tracing out this analogy with the ITDs, because often it can be like, it feels, in terms of the feeling of it all, can be, it's not inherently like a violation. You see it as the opposite in many respects. Yeah. And yet it is still a type of violation. It can be. Yeah. It can be. Obviously, there's no way to avoid any exchanges of any type, but there are ways in which if there is this concept of the mind and its need to also be protected in its own way, then you can say, well, yeah, of course you're going to hear things, just like people have certain attractions or whatever, but it doesn't mean you actually do anything with that necessarily. Sometimes it would obviously be very unsafe and inappropriate to do so. So it's just it's and now the risk is that people say, like, oh, well, protecting the mind, isn't that what like most people do who just shut out all ideas, and that's possible. But I think what's so fascinating is that it doesn't take, like, it's in the internality often of like family dynamics or within the already established sense of identity that the types of mind viruses, or I mean that's kind of I don't know if I want to reduce it to that terminology, but these ITDs that we're talking about can spread. And again, what's so challenging is what's challenging about it is recognizing it as something that is an issue. Because then again, it often comes in the guise of all of the sort of words that get associated with good things, right? Like sharing and like care and things like this, which are good, obviously, but there also can be bad. I mean, you obviously have to share something to get for STDs to occur. So it's like,
well, there's a few things. So, like, the reason why I'm interested in this metaphor of the STD, IDD, is that viruses tend to be unintentional, right? You don't intend to give anyone the flu, right? You were carrying it and you didn't know, right? Well, with an STD, unless we're talking rape, which of course occurs and is terrible, then usually the spread of a sexually transmitted disease can be mutual. It can be two people that want to have sex, and then they get a sexually transmitted disease, right? It's not, and it's so there's a certain intention that then, because there was something being carried in the sexual act that was not recognized, you then now have a latent problem, right? So what's very interesting is if you get in a family dynamic or between friends, maybe two friends say, well, it's really important to vent with your, we were talking at the net on anger, right? And so an idea is the idea that venting is good, right? And maybe friends who are intending to help one another tell the other friend, yeah, it's good to vent, you should vent. Well, actually, there's real good evidence, and Javier was talking about this, that venting is terrible. Venting doesn't help at all. It makes it way worse, unless by venting you mean talking it out to name the anger and to dissolve it, right? Yeah. But, that's a nuance, right? So you got two friends who are trying to help each other that give one another an ITD that then gets latent in them that they then employ, and they're worse off, right? But it wasn't like the friends were, an evil corporation trying to manipulate people, right? Nor was it that the friends, they intended the idea. It wasn't like a virus that was unintendedly spreading the flu. There was an intention, right? And, there was an intention to help. Just like in an act of sex, there can be an intention to have a good time, to enjoy, to do something, enriching or whatever. Well, it's spread in STD though, right? And so what's very interesting is, yes, we're aware culturally of manipulation. We're aware of algorithms controlling us. We're aware of propaganda. But actually in an information society, or a voice-based society versus task-based society, as we've talked about, there seems to be a different category, which is the spreading of intellectual diseases, if you will, or logical fallacies or problems that are intentionally spread from an act of like helping a friend. Like the STD is hidden in the sex act. Likewise, in the friendship is hidden the ITD. In the family is hidden the ITD. And then it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. And the other reason why I think the metaphor of STD might be more appropriate is often viruses you can take a pill and get over it, right? But with many STDs, you can't get rid of them entirely, or it's very, very hard to treat them, right? Well, I think intellectual diseases are like that, actually. Mm-hmm. They're very hard to get out of your system.
They're much more like, they take a much more holistic approach, or like you have to in order to actually address them.
Yes.
And to hopefully cure them, or to be better, you know, to be well again. And yeah, I think it's a great point you bring up. And the comparison there is like something that is not recognized.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what's so. And I think, I wonder. I don't know if it's as simple as this, but I do wonder if it is simply just kind of a slowing down to acknowledge potential cost. I do wonder if that's a big part of it. Like there can be too much of an assumption that again, if you want to have a good time and the other person wants to have a good time, then it's going to be
a good time,
right?
Yeah. Or good, right,
and, right. Or you just rationalize it like, well, even if we don't stay together, like it was the experience. It's like, okay, but also it's not to become paranoid or anything, but it's just to recognize, because there's obviously many sexual encounters that don't lead to STDs, but the concept is real, and it does occur, and it often is, the whole point is that it doesn't happen from it's a type of unintentional violation from an intention of pleasure, you know, which is the sort of ironic part about it. And I think that it's perhaps just not acknowledging what it actually cost.
Yes.
Anytime you want to help somebody, and this is more on the intellectual side, or anytime you want to have a good time in the sexual sense, there's always like, it's so easy in our day and age, because of some natural consequences which have kind of been stripped from certain things, to not understand that there's a cost, you know.
Sure, but even with sex, like people know in the back of their minds STDs, right? There's always that possibility, and they also know, even if they use birth control, that there is the possibility of pregnancy, right? Sure. But when they talk with each other or give advances, I don't think people have much of a sense of ITDs. They have a sense of, I'm trying to help. And
so you're saying like it's even harder.
Yeah, I mean, it's even worse.
It's even harder, because I mean, first of all, most people don't have a concept of intellectually transmitted.
Well, yeah, no, because it requires an idea to know the danger of ideas.
Exactly, which is
so it's a meta rational impasse. Like philosophy. To say philosophy is good requires philosophy, so if you don't have it, you can't reach that point. So there's a kind of like entrapment.
Or to even say philosophy is bad requires
philosophy. So
like
there's an entrapment.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think, I think you're right with that. I mean, it's much harder to acknowledge that my genuine, heartfelt, maybe even like researched attempt to help another person could really actually be transmitting a latent,
to make them sick.
Yeah, a latent kind of mindset that could be kind of diseasing to them, or a disease in that sense to them, intellectually. And so it's much harder to I do think the erosion of that awareness of cost in the sexual realm, though, influences it. Like, it's kind of a dialectical erosion of the acknowledgement of cost, because I think too, in the past, I'm not trying to like idealize it or something. I'm just saying that when people kind of, there's a lot of like the old traditions, right, that have these proverbial wisdom about like, don't let your tongue just run, and don't let words. Basically, words matter, and don't use a whole lot of them, basically. Yeah, I mean, and so it's like, to me, I feel like a lot of the wisdom traditions already were speaking to this.
Sure.
And often their proverbial wisdom would come with a lot of wisdom on restraint sexually as well, to a degree, or to have that place of finding a good wife, or whatever it is, kind of the placement of the sexuality. And the folly of the excessiveness. I mean, I understand there's excessiveness that's inherent in the human being itself, but it's almost like we sometimes only think about it in terms of the manifestations being the excess. But what if silence is a type of excess to practice, or something like that?
Sure.
I mean, obviously you can get overly excessive with silence too, but the point of the matter is that words matter, right? So but you need them, and this is another thing, like, when did I bring up I bring up fire sometimes here and there, but it is certainly like fire. in the sense that we need it, but it's like with philosophy, right? You need it to recognize that there can be bad philosophy,
Yeah.
but then it requires philosophy. So it's
Yeah.
like you can't not use fire, then you would never have light or be able to cook things.
That's right.
But you also can burn stuff down very
There's
easily.
no sex, there's no human race, right?
Sure,
so there
exactly.
has to be the risk of, say, STD or unwanted, all these different things.
Right, or some latent thing that's
Yes.
passed together. I mean, the other thing, like, I think though, yeah, I do think though that to understand potential costs can go a long way, or at least be a good starting place to understand that there is such a thing as possibly, like, you're much more reverent in terms of, oh, should I actually tell this person what I think they should do?
Yes, exactly.
Because you're like, now you can get to the place where you're cowardly and never give advice when maybe it's important, or maybe you're an elder and need to, like it's kind of now your position to do so. But there's the opposite extreme where you just sort of assume everything you're going to say is the case, and that it will make it better, and that this is the answer, and it's like, no, you are you sure about that?
Yes.
And I think the pause of understanding cost can maybe at least help people slow down a little bit when it comes to that, so that it's not just this kind of usurping of the mind,
Correct. Well, you said, I always think it's pretty fascinating that a book like Proverbs is basically like, you talk too much, when people really didn't talk very much. I mean, can you imagine today? I mean, it's
and like you said, when you have a task-based society versus a talk-based society, inherently you're just going to have less talking, because there's more that has to be
and
done.
there was too much talking even then, so let alone now,
right, where you just have constant, like, volleying of messaging between people all day long.
I mean, it's interesting because traditionally you'd have celibacy, you'd have you could have marriage, you could have more polyamorous sort of structures, and each one of them brings with it a different position in the classical world, right? Like, there's kind of ideas, and it's interesting as well because then you have intellectually the idea of like focus, wisdom, like monk study, but then you have small talk, but then you also have the rhetoricians or Gorgias using ideas to control people in talking, right? And so it's very interesting how all of those have perverse forms based on how they influence the individual, or what they spread, or what kind of lifestyle they bring about. What's interesting is different sexual ethics bring with it different lifestyles, right? Well, likewise, different approaches to ideas, or different ideas of the reverence of ideas brings different lifestyles to it, right? Like, the difference between, a monk seems to be someone who really is like, wow, we're dealing with the ideas, the mind of God. This is a very serious matter. Now you have people today, oh, it's interesting. Everything is interesting, right? It's casual, right? It's like flings. Like, people relate to ideas and advice like flings. And it's like, open sex has its flings. It's flings. There's a real sense of a lack of reverence, right? But then the perverse there's a way in which, say, some forms of Christianity, because the reverence is kind of too difficult to bear, you can just say, well, sex is, dirty and bad, right? And so you get a more Puritan structure that can be problematic, not to badmouth the Puritans, but you have that form. Likewise, you have pragmatists who are like, ideas don't do anything, they're stupid, right? They don't want anything to do with ideas, right? Who just kind of swears it off. So the hard pragmatist, in a way, has a similar metaphoric structure to the Puritan, right? Sex is evil, or ideas aren't practical. There's a similar thing. So it's very interesting how metaphorically sex and ideas have always had these strong connections. It's always the seed of an idea, the conception, the idea. And so, again, another reason why I find this metaphoric possibility of thinking about what's going on in society as a form, kind of a IDD, an intellectual ITD, intellectually transmitted disease, like an STD, is that seems more metaphorically appropriate given the link between these fields historically and in human experience, honestly. Because, like, when somebody says something to you, it feels like they're planting something, they're putting something in you, they're birthing your mind, right? They're planting a seed. Words have this sort of entering structure, right? They're very sexual. Intercourse, speaking and sex, they're all tied together. And if we think too much about bad ideas as manipulative or Viruses we just happen to catch, that it's often more intentional. It's more intentional. Yeah. Like, you don't get an STD. Again, you can be raped, but even an act of rape is an intentional act. Mm-hmm. There's a certain intention there that it's hard to imagine someone intending an STD. Right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's hard to imagine that. And yet they occur, right? In fact, they're intending the opposite of an STD, exactly. Right? And that paradox, if you will, seems critical here, because the world that gets caught up in bad ideas, it doesn't seem to be a result primarily of bad intention. It seems to be primarily a result of good intention, trying to give people good intentions, like sex is have a good time, have fun, enjoy something, and then there's an STD. So that and I'll give it to you, that for me metaphorically lines up a lot better with the experience of how ideas lead to all these trouble as STDs, quote unquote, versus mere viruses or plots of manipulation. It's more like a spreading of an ITD.
Yeah. When I wonder if maybe somebody would say, like, okay, well, maybe I can accept this happens, right? But what can really one do about it? Like, sure. Because that's kind of can be the atmosphere. And also what's hard is that the intention of one is just the inherent condition of the other, in the sense that, like, if you think about childhood, for example, your parents usually more or less have some sort of intention.
Sure.
Even if it's not hyperly thought
sure.
out into, they have some intention in what they do or why they do what they do, right? And so that's what you just absorb as sure. a child, right? Sure. You absorb certain things, and it's some of it's great and it's health in a sense, and some of it's the intellectual disease. It depends on what it is, right? Yeah. But there is some of it that is. But again, it's not always easy. It's not to call it out as, like, just to blame, the former generation or something like that, because they also went through the same process in their own development. But I think what can be helpful about the concept, and then to the first question I had, which is like what to do about it, right? Is at least acknowledging that, oh, okay, these things can be spread out of love. Like, we always use that phrase, which I think is helpful, love. Right? Like, out of love. It's, in a sense, like out of the very act of somebody wanting to demonstrate love, and yet it's outside of love, because a lot of times it can come from a place of fear or assuming you know better, and again, there's times and places for those things, but there's a lot that can go awry when we don't acknowledge that there's even a cost for care. There's even a cost for legitimate, genuine help. That and so there's just weighing that up, and living with that, since it's just is a part of life.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things. First off, again, if someone like Lacan is correct that the mind is drenched in libido, that thinking is always sexual and based on desire and different things, that would be another reason to think of what primarily happens as ITD versus intentional manipulation or a virus. The other reason why I like the virus, because the other reason why I like this metaphoric structure better, is because how do you make sure you don't get a virus, right? Well, never go outside. It's like it's a fundamentally isolationist metaphor. If you're like, never get a virus, wash your hands all the time. Like, there's a certain like fear. But when it comes to an STD, how do you make sure you don't get an STD? Well, sexually restrict yourself. Classically the way was just have sex in marriage, right? Okay. Metaphorically, that might mean if you're going to share ideas, make sure you really, 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 really study them. Because in a marriage, there's a commitment, right? There's a continualness, right? And there's this kind of idea that in that continual bound environment that naturally creates a restriction on the spread of STD, right? So likewise with ideas, if it's like, well, if you have an idea that you share, have you really, really, really committed to it?
Is it something that, like, you actually live out, or are you doing something that in your very attempt to help is something you don't like being done to you? Being slower with that. And
in a marriage situation too, is if there's a baby or if someone you're going to raise it, there's a commitment to the consequence, right?
Right.
I mean, in an STD, there's not a commitment to the consequence necessarily. The person could leave. You know,
Oh,
the one who
yeah.
gave it to you could leave or something, right?
Right, but you're kind of stuck with the consequence anyway.
Exactly.
You know?
And that's what happens to people.
Yeah,
They follow
yeah.
a bad idea that someone gave to them, and then they're gone.
That person's gone living their life, but the person's stuck with like this consequence that they
Yeah, and again,
they didn't even
yeah,
know.
and yes,
You
and
know?
sometimes with STDs, not always, the person who goes, they don't even get it. You know,
like they're fine. The other
they're
person
fine.
is
Yeah.
left with this.
That's right.
Yeah.
With a virus, you tend to only spread it if you have a fever or something, right?
Yeah.
And why would you, like, that's the issue, like, STD spread precisely because it seems like no one's sick, right? It seems like good ideas. Likewise, ITDs spread because they seem like good ideas,
Yeah.
right?
I wonder how this would work with you know, you were saying about not catching a virus being inherently isolationist. True, and that's why I was kind of bringing up at the beginning, like, oh,
It lends itself in that direction, like a bubble, like, you know.
sure. Well, I mean, that's the thought, right?
Germaphobe.
Right, but there's you know, there's the terrain theory, which kind of says to like, if you're exposed to more, then you actually can maybe recognize that there's one element that's maybe like epigenetic, and also that you develop kind of a certain tolerances because of exposure. I think I'm trying to think about this. I think what's interesting though is that there's a difference between the fact that there is an atmosphere that we all exist in, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's the existence of libido in like our economy, or the fact that people, like I was saying, people do share things that you didn't ask them to tell you something, or you didn't ask them to give some advice, but now they have. I think what's important though is realizing, like, that is the whole idea of discussing it and understanding, I think, viruses is actually to become, like I was saying, not more fragile, but anti-fragile, in the sense that you become more robust. But you also say no to certain things, in the sense that I hate to reduce it to simply the idea of boundaries, but I do think there's something where there are certain things that you say, I will not let that inside of myself.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
Like you do make intentional decisions so that you don't have to have, like, why take the risk of, like, for example, I'm not going to start smoking. Like, I've always thought this since I was younger. Yeah. Like, I don't want to start smoking, like, just cigarettes, for example, because I'm like, I don't want to put that inside myself, because sure, maybe there are people who don't get addicted, but there's a lot of people you see so many times where people are like, I've been trying to quit for 10 years, 30 years, and I can't quit smoking. Yeah. And I'm like, I just don't want to take that risk. That's not a risk that I feel is worth it, you know?
Yeah, you don't have to quit something you don't start.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So what I mean to say is, like, well, one could say, well, if you're really going to make yourself robust, you know, you would try all the things and then just let yourself become immune to the, but I think there's a bothness at play. What I mean to say is, I think that there is a terrain theory concept that is true. I think there's also the fact that terrain doesn't mean you necessarily ingest just anything you see. Like, you do recognize it, like, oh, that's decaying, whatever. Just because I'm not going to be afraid of it doesn't mean I literally, like, rub it into my bloody wound or something. You know, or smoking, like, I can acknowledge this in the world and not be afraid of it, but I also am not going to intentionally put it inside of myself in that sexual sense. So I think that's, I mean, not cigarette, but just on the abstract level of what cigarettes mean. So it's like this recognition of being able to not, you say, oh, well, there could be all these, like, you know, unrecognized things that are spreading between what people say, so therefore I'm just gonna, like, never talk to people.
Yes.
You could do that. That's a Puritan approach with sex, right? Or it can be, right? Like, where this is just bad. And, you know, you can meet that there are certain groups that kind of feel that way, literally feel that way about sexuality. No, it's about understanding that it exists in the world. It's a part of the human psyche and experience. However, I can be selective with what I choose to ultimately put inside of myself. Sure. Though I realize that if I'm exposed to that because, well, it's the world, and somebody's going to come and say something, or something's going to, you know, pop up on a screen or whatever, you say, okay, I'm robust enough to not be completely destroyed by that, because I can destroy it. I know how to destroy it versus it destroying me, basically. Well, not a destroy, but you know what I'm saying. You shut certain things down because you realize, not people. I'm saying more on this abstract level of the ideas, where you say, no, like, I'm not going to let that idea let its seed plant inside of me. I see the seed is there, but I'm not going to put it inside of myself and dwell on it and make it this immense thing. Well, so I know there's a lot there. But
well, that's interesting. There's a few interesting angles there. So there's a few things. First, the only way that, you know, on the terrain theory, in order to get there, you have to have the idea that actually, if I get ill, like if I catch a virus, then that can actually create natural immunity. If your first impulse is, I feel ill, therefore take a pill, you may never actually develop natural immunity. So you have to have an idea about the idea, right? So likewise, exposure to bad ideas can strengthen your intellectual rigor if you're able to recognize bad ideas and you see it as an exposure to ideas, which means when you hear your friends telling you to do something, you know that they may be wrong, right? You have to have a certain orientation to the delivery of ideas, right? Likewise, you have to have a certain orientation to getting sick. What should your response be to getting sick, right? So, so likewise, like that terrain theory brings with it a meta move.
Well, really quick, I mean, what this is making me think, I hope we can articulate this. When it comes, see, you know how we were talking about, like, it's not just inherent, like, people are trying to be manipulative or trying to be mean that causes these problems. I think this is why train theory might be helpful here, because a lot of times if you just think about virus equals it's all over, like it's apocalyptic, you'll never realize that actually there's very good things that are virus like, or it's proportionality right of those things, not the existence of them or the exposure to them, but it's the proportionality and the internalization of
your response.
So
your response
how do you respond
to it.
do you take it up or not, do you recognize, do you cultivate other things inside of yourself that can combat what might come your way or whatever you encounter,
I mean, people have bad sexual encounters that changes their life for the better, right? I mean, people have, because they change their way of thinking about it, right? They kind of wake up. Like, people have, like, look at all these young men who have had encounters with pornography that have made them go, I don't want to live like this. I want to change things, right? So, it's, but this is the weird thing. You have to have an idea. There's an idea of the frame itself in which you are thinking. Right. But that's philosophy,
Yeah, but I think what we're talking about is super important, because I'd always have this kind of, I can wrestle with this question. I've talked with Cadell about this before too, with negativity, where I think that's why I think sometimes, when we talk about like the litmus test of like facing your fears can be more helpful, because if it's just about encountering negativity, then I should have been, I should have tried that cigarettes when I was 18,
exactly.
right? I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. But what I mean to say is, like, it's more about realizing, like, I think to direct yourself, acknowledging fear versus I should be able to just encounter negativity so that I can become more robust. Well, what exactly are you getting yourself? Are you going to crawl around on your knees all day because it's hard and therefore it should make you stronger? You won't, and you shouldn't. Like, it's a wisdom between those things, right?
But you see what, this is why all rationality starts with a non-rational or a pre-rational move. So, for example, what this would mean is that before you talk, give someone ideas. What's your ideas about ideas? Like, what's your negativity about negativity? Like, you have to always have a meta move. And basically, if you don't have the meta move, you're probably in trouble. So, for example, when it comes to sex, have you ever thought, what is sex? Like, has there ever been a meta move of sex? It's like, I enjoy it, so you just do it, right? Well, your likelihood of ending up in a pretty bad place if you don't ask, what is the thing? What is its context? What is its framing? What is it for? Then you have not taken the meta step, which would be the pre-rational step of the non-rational, not to use that language here too much. Then you're just, it's just not a good policy. It's just probably not going to work out because you haven't thought about the thing that you're doing. But again, the great mystery is, how do you have the thought that you need to think about thoughts before you think, right? Like, where does it come from? Where does that realization occur from?
Yeah. Well, that's the sort of ironic thing, because, again, it takes an idea. Like, I'm thinking about the wisdom traditions again. There are ideas about ideas. Yeah. There are ideas about words. There are ideas.
I mean, honestly, historically, it was from the community and the eldership, right?
Sure.
Like, this is why there's this line of thought and tradition that everyone has to be customized into, like, brought into. Acclimated into. Otherwise, there will not be pre-thought about thought. People will just think what they think, and they'll do what they think they ought to do because they've never pre-thought about thinking, and you're probably going to have trouble, right? I mean, like, look, if people said, hey, just because, the moment people, it's interesting too on the metaphor, right? Because when people hit puberty, they just want to have sex, right? And you need a community and a society to repress it, like Freud talks about, because if everyone just follows their animalistic instincts, you're in huge trouble. Society collapses, right? So there has to be a certain civilizing structure structure, which then creates all these tensions between releases and givens, repressions, and all of that. The whole field of psychoanalysis. What's interesting here is we know that puberty has to be met. It has to be channeled and contained. And Roger Scruton said, he said sex is a problem. It's not, in terms of society, it is a problem. It's not simply an enjoyment. Acting like it's simply something you enjoy is how you get an anti-culture, as Philip Reeve said. No, sex is a problem. That doesn't mean a bad thing. That means it's something you have to address, right?
Exactly.
Well, the funny thing is, I think ideas are exactly the same. Ideas are a problem. That doesn't mean they're bad. Ideas are, people have ideas. That's the problem. And in the same way, what happens with young people? They have a whole lot of ideas of how to do things better and how the world should be, just like they have a lot of desire for sex, right? Like there's something very interesting about, there's like a puberty phase with ideas. Yeah. Very similar to sex, where there's an explosion of just, I have all these ideas on how we could do things, and this, and the younger are so smart, with all their ideas. But actually, that's the problem, because then you get these utopian projects that get a lot of people killed. Likewise, you get this unrestricted sex that creates a lot of sexually transmitted diseases and problems, right? So that's there's another reason, there's another connection there, I think.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if there was like basically, it's difficult to kind of, what I'm trying to say is like to kind of reestablish or reimagine or something with the wisdom traditions, because it almost makes me think, okay, so people kind of maybe get it more on a biological level because it's like very visceral and very it's very vivid, Now, unfortunately, not everybody makes it through that too. Like, they could have sexual addictions, or they could live with consequences the rest of their life because they made certain impulsive, animalistic, like you're saying, that from that animalistic desire place. So it's true that happens. But on the whole, society works to try to give a sense of like you're saying, or it was the wisdom traditions often that gave civilization to, let's civilize those desires so that we can put them in a proper place, right? We can put the fire in the hearth, we can put the fire on the wick. But if that's not like, are people stuck in the sort of like prepubescent or pubestic or that phase of their life for ideas? Is that like, do you think that's what is actually happening? And in that case, because is it just like a sense of, okay, if we could have that cultivation that, well, maybe again, it just goes back to the idea about the ideas again, where people can just get back to like, okay, these things are just like sex. These things are just like fire. Then we can kind of start to work better with them.
100%.
Because I think the challenging thing too is that sometimes people see even their elders struggling with drama, struggling with things, and so then they kind of lose hope that there could be an elder tradition to guide on ideas about ideas. Now, I think what's great about wisdom traditions is like their longevity, right? Like they've stuck around for a reason, right? Like there's reasons why they're still around. You could still say we should tear them all down and not have them, but a lot of it's like, well, maybe they have stuck around because they've made it on like a evolutionary respect or something like that. Which I guess I know what I mean to say is like it's weird because it shows the type of. It's hard to say it though, because it comes often from the place of care, and it may even come from people who are older. Then it's like this, but it's a type of immaturity. But then if you're a younger person, you're like, should I trust that assessment because I am actually the younger person? So do I just have ideas about this? Sorry,
well, there's but the moment a young person is asking that question, that would be a pre-framing move that's very healthy. Like even to go, I want to have sex, but should I have sex? Like that right there is a good move. That's always going to probably be the first step. That's self-doubt. The question is if the self-doubt goes into self-deconstruction or if the self-doubt is the beginning of a kind of Dante ascent. Well, there's a few things. First, I wanted to say on the terrain theory stuff, like with that, like again, it's all if you go out and get sick and you have no concept of natural immunity or building up, then you're just going to go take medicine. So what ends up happening is people go encounter bad ideas that are a result of following what their friends told them to do, and their response is, well, I need to go ask my friend again. Like they're just, your response to what you encounter in the terrain is not given to you by the terrain. So you can, it doesn't, so yeah, sure. Like there's the idea that exposure to, bad ideas or viruses could be good for you, but that is all contingent upon how you think you should respond.
Well, that's
to what
where
you
terrain
encounter.
theory also relies on what are you cultivating in yourself, right?
Well,
That's why
exactly.
they talk a lot about like diversifying your microbiome and all of that sort of thing,
Yes,
right? Because
so
it's like, well, it's not just about you being like
exposed.
doing whatever the heck you like with yourself and then exposing yourself to danger, basically, and then just expecting it's going to be fine. It's like, have you been nourishing yourself?
But it's no
have you
different
been
than,
giving yourself
exactly
sunshine?
It's exactly the same with ideas. Like you exposing yourself to ideas, if you're not doing any of your own scholarship or work or thinking, can be very, it's not going to do anything. Or it could be dangerous, honestly. You just get killed. Likewise, exposing yourself to viruses without doing any, or bacteria without doing any self-work to work on your own health might just get you killed, right?
And selection is a part of it. Like we were saying, I mean, a lot of the wisdom traditions, or at least some, maybe more on the Western side, but would be like having one partner sexually, right? Like in marriage, because it's like selectivity. What I'm framing that as one of the considerations for your own health. Like, for example, you'd be like, I will have, that means I have to actually make these delineations. Like, I'm not just going to eat anything, right? I'm going to eat these certain things, or I'm going to source from these certain places. And it's a type of, you're kind of restricting yourself, but so that you can actually have, theoretically, in the terrain sense, the more robust and abundant, like, terrain.
Well, intellectually, that was the mentor. That was the approach. We don't have any mentors. We don't have any elders. We don't have any older generations. So as a result, you're left to just go sexually explore, intellectually explore, which then, you get an STD, you get an ITD, or you get in trouble, right? So we've lost the intellectual equivalent of that. Now, the other things to say is that Lacan has that famous idea that intercourse is, conversation, words is sex, just like sex, right? Zupancha tells us that sex is the revelation of the negativity, right? This kind of so there's this idea that speaking and sex are connected, right? Well, basically, we're just saying, well, if that's so, then there should be an STD parallel in speaking, right? It's ITDs, okay? So the idea is that they're on the same gradient, right? So part of the idea is that, and this goes to Dante, is that actually sex, eros, is on the road to agape. Like, sex is actually usually the instinct that starts us toward wisdom. And there's always hope, actually, because even if all resources for wisdom and elders and society is gone, we still want to have sex. And that means there's a drive. There's a desire that could become a drive leading beyond the sex act that is nevertheless fueled by eros. So, and, if Lacan is right that intercourse leads to intercourse, that intercourse and sex leads to actually a enjoyment in speaking, or it can be sublimated into that, sublated and, sublimated, sublation as sublimation and all of that. Well, then, that thought is very much located in Dante. But here's the rub. Whereas it's very difficult to imagine, well, impossible, for a society to exist that would make you forget sex, because you just naturally have it. Unfortunately, it is possible to lose sight of the higher agapes, because you're making this point of what happens if you lose the preframe, right? Well, Dante would say there's always the possibility of getting it back, because you have the eros, that, and let me put it this way. If you always have desire, then there's always the possibility of desire failing. And following Lacan and Zupančič, like, it's the failure of desire that forces you to ask the question of, can desire move into drive, right? So the very fact that you have desire means there's always hope in its failure, right? Now, maybe 99% of people don't interpret that failure as evidence of the need to move to drive. But if it occurs, there's still that possibility.
Right.
There's always the possibility of a free prey move at the failure, right? Like, the chances of a pre-thought thought without social capital, intentional about that, say a wisdom infrastructure or something.
Right.
Without that, your best bet is the failure. Because when it fails, you're basically forced to conclude two things. This failed because life sucks, nihilism, you give up, or you say, well, what if this failed because I'm just wrong in my entire thinking about what desire is?
Yeah.
The very
and what this is for.
Yeah, that's right.
What this is toward.
Yeah, the very failure of desire, of which is always possible if you have desire, is a unique experience that's more high in likelihood that it leads you to ask pre-thought thoughts or frame questions, questions about the very way you interpret reality, than basically anything else. That's why the failure is so big in Hegel. That's why the failure is so big in psychoanalysis, is because even if you don't have a wisdom tradition, infrastructure, the very experience of failure is uniquely positioned to make you ask, is there more? Yeah. Is this it? Right? Yeah. So we are in an age, though, where because, like, to your question, well, how do we have the frame questions, the pre-thought thoughts, if we no longer have elders, we don't have religion, churches, families, if your parents are not doing this, what hope do you have? Yeah. It's not by chance that everyone's talking about lack. Not by chance that everyone's talking about the real, right? Because that's it. That's basically what the majority will have.
Yeah. No, I thought that was great, Daniel, and answered the question really well. And it's encouraging to know that the hope is within what it is, even in its failure. Right.
And this is the key to providence in Dante, because even hell, the bottom of hell, is only possible because of God. Like, even in the devil, we were talking with Cleo and Dimitri, the devil is frozen. So the very experience of Satan as frozen suggests fixedness. And your experience of fixedness is, it shouldn't be fixed because I'm moving and there's time and reality isn't fixed. And if the very bottom of hell is fixedness, and yet it's here, it shouldn't be here. There shouldn't be continuation, so it automatically points beyond itself, right? So no matter how dark it gets, let me put it another way. No matter how dark it gets in Dante, actually the darker it gets, the more likely you are to ask the question, does it really have to be this dark? And the moment you even ask the question that says, is this as dark as it gets, means you have the idea of an alternative. And if you have the idea of an alternative, there's hope, right? Yeah. And actually, the darker it gets, the more likely you are to ask about alternatives, because it gets too bad. It's just like Satan's defeat is killing God. That should be his ultimate victory, but it's precisely in the killing of God that makes you see the terror of what Satan is doing fully, which then makes you see the terror of it, so you change, right? So that is the kind of interesting fact, is that as long as there are humans, going back to what we were saying, and I'll give it back to you, as long as there are humans, there's going to be Eros. And as long as there's Eros, there's going to be the possibility of Eros failing. And you could even say the inevitability of Eros failing. Well, then there's always hope. Yeah. No matter how bad it gets, there's always hope, because Eros will fail.
Yeah. What I think what's nice about that is in the sense that it doesn't stay there, though, right? You talk a lot about movement in Dante.
Yes.
And the point is not to just, stay in that failure.
Yes.
You could get stuck there. That's what a lot of nihilism is, or just sort of seeing it as irrelevant or meaningless. But it's like, oh, no. You suddenly have this failure with it, this experience of failure with it, which makes you question if it is meaningless or what is the meaning anyways, if it failed me in this profound way. So that you can actually have a redemption of that very thing. Yes. In its movement forward, to understand what it is ultimately toward, which is the agape.
Yeah, because the moment you say this failed, well then there's hope. You're almost more doomed if you're looking at something that's a failure and you can't tell it's a failure, right? But desire cannot help but always have with it the possibility in its very operation of leading you to a failure you see as a failure. So it cannot be divided from that potential hope. Like, again, another way to put it, like when you see Satan frozen, you're forced to say, if I don't keep moving, the only option now is to freeze. Well, you can't deny that evil is fixedness, because that's basically what Dante is saying. Like, evil is fixedness. The inability to move is evil. That's because fixedness is a privation of movement. Fixedness is only possible, and this is the key reversal. In Dante, it is not that fixed things move. It's that reality moves, and when it's not looking at the beautiful, it becomes fixed. We tend to think that objects move, when really the truth of the matter is everything is motion that manifests as things. So it's like time, it's like Lee Sprolin and Bergson again. It's like space is a manifestation of time, not time relative to space, right? In hell, time is relevant to space. It's an illusion. In hell, time's an illusion. Let me put it this way. In hell, what happens is Dante's like, wow, hell only makes sense if time is an illusion, and that's impossible. Therefore, this must be a privation of a higher ontology, if you will.
Well, just really quick to bring in something you brought up before about, because I was thinking about that a little bit, the idea of flings and stuff like that, fixations that can occur, it's basically spurious infinity repetitions of sexuality or sexual experiences because of that, like wanting to get that fix again and again and again. Just to throw in all those words there. But I guess I think there's something very paradoxical happening there, maybe ironic, but because isn't that the irony is like, oh, if they're being flung about by these impulses and about these whims and these desires and I got to get to the next better thing or the next more interesting thing or the next more sexy sex or whatever, then isn't that a type of movement?
Is it actually, you're not moving, you're being flung. You yourself are not moving, you're being flung. The key language that Dante uses when he talks about, and Cleo brought this up, and this is exactly right. Dante understood that when you're in lust, it's Medusa's stare. Like, you're stone. You can't move. It's like, Dante has this, after Beatrice dies, there's this younger girl that he just can't stop. He's obsessed with. Like, lust has a fixedness that looks like maniac, but actually the maniacal obsession is actually kind of sealed. It's actually covering a lack of motion. So they can't stop thinking about things.
It's the hamster wheel,
yeah,
right?
It's
like you're constantly on to the next thing, right?
Yes, but you're actually not going anywhere.
But it's all because you want this ultimate, in your brain thought of what it is to feel sexually gratified, right? So it's like this, you're constantly on a hamster wheel. So in a sense, it's but versus actually moving through space and time, the avenues of terrain.
Well, in Dante,
actually, because I'm trying to think here.
The only movement is inner movement. Any movement that is not inner movement is not actually movement in a way. It's an illusion of movement. Because
that would be the other thing too, where it's like I'm moving from girl to girl. I must be having lots of movement. I know that's a silly reduction, but I think it's important to address because
you're spiritually not changing at all.
No, because you literally are.
You're controlled by lust.
The stoneness of the lust is that you're so set on wanting to get that thing.
Yes.
And you're trying to get that thing through multiple avenues because you've never found any to be satisfying enough, or it just couldn't last forever, right? So you have to go and do it again.
I believe in Inferno, lust is right. The punishment for lust is like you're blown around in the wind, you're just blown, and aren't you moving? No, you're being flung. You're being flung around. You yourself are not moving. You're being flung. And that's the weird thing. You can't... the odd thing is everything in Dante is about order because there's a way in which if you're fixed on beauty, you're moving. But if you're not fixed on beauty, you are fixed. And it looks like you're moving, but you're actually not. So it's always... all bad things are a disordered good. That's why it's the same substance. That's why this is all hard.
It's difficult,
the very sex that is eros and part of the logic of the beatific vision is the very sex that leads to lust, STDs, and different things. Ideas that can lead to the contemplation of the divine are also the things that can give you an ITD, right?
Absolutely.
If life, maturity is the recognition that is the movement from when you're young, life is about a lot discerning the difference between the good and the bad. When you get older, it's about discerning different goods. But that was so difficult. That was too difficult for us, so we started saying it's relative and just preference. No, in the classical mind, no. It is definitely disordered good. It's all goods. It's all, in a sense, relative. But that's the challenge, not the dismissal. We've used relativity to dismiss the problem of the good, say, well, it's all relative. For the classical mind, no, that's why the good is a lifelong challenge, because it is conditioned.
And relativity means there's
ordering. Yes, it's relative to the order. And
not disorder or no relevant order. It's like, no,
it's conditioned by the order. It's relative to the order. And in the classical mind, it's like, oh my gosh, we got to figure out the order, and it's not obvious. And so it's not...
like relativity. Order doesn't matter because it's all relative.
Correct. Well, to bring it back to the example, like in the classical mind, one of the reasons you stay married and only have sex with one person is because love is so complex and the human experience so difficult and so many caveats and developments that have to happen. The only way you have any chance
for that.
Bandwidth for that is with one person.
Yeah.
You do it with two, it's just practically impossible. There's no way you could have polyamory. You could have 5 people that you go to the depth of what it is to be human with, and not be destroyed, like a full Beatrice smile before you're ready for it, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the key. It's like, it's not that, you know, for the classical mind, you could say the idea of polyamory is simply impossible. Like, it's not it's not even like unethical.
Yeah,
it's just like simply impossible. Because the nature of the depth of the human being is you have to focus on one being.
Yeah.
And they're infinitely deep in that oneness. And all you can possibly do is dilute that encounter of the real to move it toward the beatific in a single person. Otherwise, it will be diluted. And you'll simply be destroyed. And inevitably what happens is the multiplicity in a marital context becomes a way to avoid the depth, to keep yourself moving as opposed to inwardly moving.
Sorry, what was that?
Like, what ends up happening when you have multiple, you know, you don't tend to inwardly move. You tend to externally move between without you developing internally.
Absolutely, and that's where the stone, you know, like you're saying from Cleo's observation about the Medusa gaze and the stoneness of the person. It's quite true, because there's very little internal work that has to be done to kind of actually pull, you know, kind of actually hone and develop and cultivate that desire into a drive, right? You just kind of let it be what it is and just go from person to person to person.
Yeah, no, I don't want to say it's impossible. Is it possible that there's a person that could go to a certain depth of experience with 3 spouses or something like that? Maybe, but it would certainly not be a good bet. And if you assume that you are, that's almost a guarantee that you're not. And then also, honestly, without getting too much into it, something like multiple wives was probably, you know, you would see in task-based societies versus voice-based society, because it's a survival thing, right? People like their husbands died in the war, so they all fall to the brother or the uncle or the king or different things. But then it has this logistical function, right? To talk about multiple spouses in a relatively middle-class, wealthy society where your challenge is depth, is an entirely different matter. And basically, once it gets to that point, anything more than a single person is in Dante, Beatrice smiling too much too quickly, and you're reduced to ash. And I think we simply see that. Well, I think you simply see that.
Right, and you can never really be truly face to face with any more than one person.
Sure.
You know, in terms of, I'm just thinking about the imagery, you know, of like actually being.
Yeah, you can only look at one person. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, you can't look at two. You can't really look at into somebody's eyes.
Correct.
Into their soul, in a sense, with more than one person at the same time. I think too. Just really one like kind of like quick last note that was coming to mind in terms of internal movement. I mean, I think too the restrictive to one spouse, you know, to one person, and the movement that would therefore occur within is because, you know, there's also a lot of having to work with, you know, we talked about that with the quality of repetition.
Yes.
Well, now you're suddenly like actually forced to learn how to cultivate something within yourself, to see the newness within the mundane, or to see like the difference in the sameness, you know, in a good
that's
way.
right. It really forces you to face that challenge.
It really does. And I think also, like, just quite physically for a woman on her part, she, you know, if she's going to have, you know, have sex with her one partner, like with her spouse, I mean, that usually would also mean an internal change of conceiving a child, actually birthing a child physically. There's so much change that comes with that, where you learn to like welcome into the world a new life or new lives, and that was the change. Like that's the massive amounts of change there. And so, but it's interesting how we don't really give that type of change credence in terms of like the development of the self, because I'm just saying that for much of human history, that was kind of where that was where was located the actually having to like come into yourself. Yeah. Was that kind of actually giving over yourself to the other person, and therefore yielding these other beings too, you know, that's where, and because, you know, it's, I guess what I mean to say is like that change is very all consuming, but also quite can be like really quite a prize in a sense, because it does require having to learn how to do like good repetition, like quality repetition in your life, and actually have to be changed in ways you didn't really want to, you didn't, you didn't really kind of want to have to be pushed in that direction, or that's uncomfortable, or that feels difficult, but it's also very rewarding,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it comes back to some things from earlier. So, generally speaking, things like polyamory benefits men more than women. Women can be taken advantage of by it. It tends to favor a society with birth control, because if you have multiple wives and they're all getting pregnant, it's usually going to be, well, so who's taking care of the children where? You introduce all these social negotiation dynamics, then you get jealousy, you get all this stuff. So it's hard to not think that polyamory seems to be very much nested in a certain technological horizon. So, on ideas of could it spiritually, I hear these ideas that, people talk about in polyamory. You got to work on your jealousy, and you got to come to terms with your own desire to, to be a jealous being, and you have to face that, and you have to, it's really spiritually nurturing, quote unquote, to face that. And sure, maybe, it's one of those things where, you could say federalism. Once we begin to see thriving civilizations that are based on polyamory, that do not have collapsing birth rates, and that are creatively and spiritually more advanced than all the other societies, sure, then we'll see. But it could be one of those things where polyamory technically doesn't have to end up in these spiritual pathologies we're talking about, but practically it always does, right? We talk all the time about how the distinction between technical and practical is extremely beneficial to ideology and what you want to believe, because, there's lots of things that are technically possible, but practically never manifest, so you can continue to try them, because technically they might work, but practically they just never do. But that very division allows plausible deniability. You see what I'm saying? So the reason why I say all that is because on the example of the terrain theory earlier, you could definitely say, well, if I really love my wife, then I should go to a strip club, sit there, and just see if I'm tempted, and it's like, that seems really stupid. Like, are you an idiot? And it's like, no, if I really loved her, I would be able to do that, right? Where you're creating challenges for what purpose and what end, right? And actually there's a certain arrogance there, where I'm such a devoted husband that I could be in a strip club and it wouldn't have any effect on me at all, right? Like, you're kind of very prideful in that. And there's a danger in, say, for example, with the polyamory, where there can be a kind of pride, where I'm the kind of being that can actually handle all of the temptations that would come to avoid the real in multiple spouses, and I won't do that. It will be purely spiritually advancing, right? There could be a danger of that. Or if you say, well, I'm so healthy that I can expose myself to any viruses and bacteria and my body will be able to recover from it, right? Like, that's where you've moved into pride. But this is also why classically pride was such a big problem, because pride is what gets everything out of proportion.
Yes.
So much in Aristotle, virtue ethics, and all of that is proportionality, temperance, discernment, and the number one threat to that is pride. Because I think we get very confused with pride. Because often we say, pride is when you think you don't need God. The Christian will say pride is when you put yourself above God, or think you're better than other people. Yes, sure. But I think a more helpful understanding of pride is the notion that you don't need to worry about proportionality. Because no matter what happens, you're fine, right? Like, no matter what environment you're in, you're fine, right? Because that's getting a little bit more at what pride is. And that's why pride comes before the what? Fall, right? Well, why do you fall? Because you got out of proportion. Like, if you overly think pride as, I'm going to rule the world, or I'm better than everyone, then we're like, you fell because you climbed high up, you got all the money and power, and then you lost it all, and that's what pride is, right? Now, of course, that is a form of pride, because that, by definition, lacks proportion. But if we overthink that example, we don't get how pride is when you really don't seriously realize that you need to think proportion and environment and discernment, right? Where you're like, it doesn't matter. I'll be able to walk into any environment and be fine. I won't be tempted. I'll always use polyamory to spiritually advance, not spiritually avoid the difficult, right? That's pride. And likewise, when you go, I'm so healthy, I don't need to worry about anything, right? And and then you get sick and die or something, right? So that, likewise, I guess the other example, like, a lot of people say, oh, well, I know that the news is bullcrap. I know that they're manipulating me, and yet you watch it 24/7. There's a kind of pride in that, because you do get manipulated. You don't think the news can screw with you, because you think that's the IDD version of this, right? Like the intellectual version of this is people like, I know that cell phones are destroying my focus, but I'll be okay. I know that, right? No, that's a kind of pride, because you're not, it's not pride in this Luciferian sense, but it is a kind of like idea that I am above the environment. I am above the external stimuli, right? No, you're going to get an IDD.
Well, yeah. I mean, couldn't let's say somebody who's very pro polyamory or practices it,
sure.
Couldn't they say that there's a pride in monogamy though?
Can be. It depends, but I think for most of history, monogamy, well, if like certainly from a Zupancha, it's not a pride. It's locking you in with the real.
Yeah,
it's locking you in with the negativity.
Well, I think that's the other thing. I don't think. Well, it depends on who you talk to, but I don't think the wisdom traditions kind of made it out to be like this. There were just very practical and logistical realities to them to marriage.
Basically, all civilization, many, maybe every civilization had periods of multiple wives and different family structures. Pretty collectively and emergently, people went in the direction of more sexually bounded, because there's something about children that does that. Now, then you get into stuff like traditional family versus nuclear family and all that different stuff. But there, even, I'm not sure, it's true, wisdom traditions tend to reinforce a certain sexual ethic. But the sexual ethic may have came more before the wisdom tradition, simply because people's sexual activities tend to revolve around what they find logistically works ultimately.
Yeah.
And there's also power laws. Power laws might not be the right phrase, but there's also people that, men that have a lot of money and power can afford to basically sleep around all they want, and because they don't face a price for it, whereas people who have less power and money can't do that so regularly, right? So there's also status and economic factors at play as well.
Yeah, I think too the idea of there being I mean, anyone can claim anything about anyone else about pride. I think though that there might be more of a sense of I think anytime you're sort of saying like, I'm doing this and I'm impervious to X, Y, or Z.
Yes.
And I can handle that. Well, maybe not. Like, I think that's the challenge of it, where it's like, and that's true for anyone in whatever they choose to do.
But before
I think, sorry,
please.
Really quick, I want to just bring in really quick though the consequences element, because somebody might be like, oh no, like it's not so much that you should sort of prove your robustness on an emotional, physical, spiritual level by, putting yourself in the line of temptation. It's like you can actually start to justify it's okay that you're tempted. Like it's great that you're aroused by the other women, because that actually shows that you're able to still express yourself, even though you've limited yourself to monogamy.
Yes.
And I think but that can only exist really without actual consequences.
Exactly.
And a lot of times, of course, like the sex industry will rely on separating sex from conception and child rearing, and it's just that you start to justify things as spiritually developed, which are. They could only be called such a thing if you don't have actual consequences.
Yes, that's right.
Like
that's
touching fire and not realizing, oh my gosh, my hand's burning.
That's correct.
And it's like, and really, like we are, as human beings, we do seem to have this, because you can only choose, it's almost like, because you can only have your one life, you can only have your one wife, for example. I mean, I know that's kind of a silly phrase, but why I'm saying that is because as human beings, we do seem to struggle with juggling how to take care of, the multiplicity of dynamic would usually, like I said, come within the family itself. Now you have your own needs and your husband's needs and your children's needs, right? But then we have this element of like, if I have multiple partners, but we're also not gonna have children, or maybe we'll have a few, but we'll all learn to how to like be the village, but we'll all kind of there's a kind of maybe that they're just saying, well, we're just trying to practice that multiplicity of needs in a different manner. Yes. Okay. And like you said, it's just kind of time tells, right? Yeah. Whatever ends up working for society is what usually ends up surviving, but I just think that there is something about, really having to kind of remember, and that's what, going back to what I said at the beginning about the cost, if you reincorporate consequences, it puts into proportionality it gives proportion to what you can justify.
Yes.
What you can say is spiritually robust, because otherwise it gets very murky, I think, because in some ways it's sort of, you can kind of just from an intellectual level try to say, okay, well, I can hear each of those perspectives, but what actually is like seemingly most in line with the human experience, and the sense that humans do seem to feel a sense of it being wrong. They would take it not very nicely if their husband was sleeping around, right? Why is that?
Well, there's a few things. So first off, saying something is spiritual is often just a really effective way to rationalize it. Like, oh, I'm spiritually advancing. Well, you can say that about anything, right?
Yeah.
And so it's dangerous, like philosophy, in the sense you can philosophize about anything and use philosophy to justify anything if you're not careful.
Right.
And yet you must philosophize, right? Likewise, spiritual. Oh, yeah, having sex with 50 women is a great spiritual practice. Why? By what metric? But you can say that, and in your mind you go, well, maybe. I don't know. Well, there you go. Because philosophy can always play the negative. It can always say, well, you don't know, and here's the reason why it might. Because, if you sleep with 50 women, you have to work on your jealousy, and you have to learn to let go and not be possessive. I can come up with lots of reasons. But again, going to Vico, David Hume, all those cats, that is the problem with thought. You can always create plausible sounding reasons, right? And spiritual stuff can do that, right? So the question ultimately becomes, what is the heuristic that something is really spiritual? Well, I think it's increasing courage. Are you more courageous afterwards?
Yeah.
Do you fear more? It actually goes to what you were saying too. A lot of people go, I can handle this. That should not be what you're asking. We talk about it all the time. Is the things you should do are the things you're afraid to do.
Yeah.
Like, the problem is saying I can handle it is you're not afraid, right? Well, you could be saying that from I can do this. But generally, if it's kind of like, no, I can go to a
prideful or arrogant.
Yeah. Pride is when you say I can handle this. Like, yeah, I can go to a strip mall and not, be tempted. That's pride.
Yeah.
Well, fear, you really need to focus on the things you're afraid to do, not just setting up things to prove that you can do them. That's kind of the difference. When pride is when you set up things to prove you can do them. Courage is when you face these things that you're afraid to do, right? That you really don't want to do. You don't want to prove anything. You don't want to do it. There's something about pride that wants to show off, and the reason why. That's why you're in trouble if you're saying I can do this, in that sense of, I'm gonna prove I can do this. I'm gonna set myself up. If you are setting yourself up for a challenge to show that you're spiritually advanced to handle it, like going to a strip club to not be tempted, that's pride. Yeah. That is not what. In fact, the wisdom tradition would be like, no, you're supposed to assume that you wouldn't be able to handle. The wise. Yeah. Noble, virtuous thing to do would say you couldn't handle it. Well, how do you square that with facing your fears? Exactly. There's a big difference, and you can tell in the experience of it, right? But so you should never, ever have your action be motivated by the I'll show them.
Well, and that's where I think a lot of the intellectual transmitted disease come from, right?
Exactly.
It's it's the,
putting in environments to show you can.
It's like, I don't even care if this is going to ruin the friendship. I need to tell them the truth. You know what I mean? Like,
that's right.
And I think there's a lot of like being willing, like you're proving that you'll even self-sacrifice for the sake of helping another person, proving this or proving that, and it's like that's exactly where the ITD can come from. I mean,
proving instead of
I'm not
facing
saying
fear.
It's always related to pride, but I think there's probably some element to it where.
But this is why
it's involved, it's a culprit.
This is why we get in trouble to over associate pride with power and rulership. Pride is more of proving. There's a proof. Now, the reason why the CEO can be associated with pride is because often the CEO wanted to become a CEO to prove to everyone he was the best, right? But at the core of it is this proving. Like proving, I'm gonna prove to them I'm willing to sacrifice anything. I'm gonna prove to them I'm willing to say the hard things. I'm gonna prove to them. Your motivation should never be to prove anything. It should be on the side of courage. Now, it's not easy to tell the difference always on when you're trying to prove yourself versus be courageous. Yeah. It's generally a pretty good rule of thumb that if you can't tell the difference, you shouldn't act. That's a pretty... Not yet, right? At least not yet. Let it really ripen on the vine. If you can't tell the difference, that's a pretty good reason to let the fruit ripen. Because the moment you go, but I don't have time. Well, now you're acting out of what? Fear. So like it almost,
Yeah.
you see how it's circular.
And acting out of fear is not facing your fear. Like
exactly, that's what I'm saying. So the reason
yeah.
why, if you can't tell the difference, you probably should wait, is because the only reason you wouldn't wait is because you're afraid. Well, that right there means you're acting out of fear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the meta, but this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the meta move. Yeah. If you can make the meta move, you can break that birdie and donkey problem. You can break that rational impasse. When how do I tell the difference between proving and courage? Well, by making the meta move on can you wait or not? And if you can't wait, that means you're acting out of fear, right? Mm-hmm. So the meta move breaks the impasse. Yeah. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That the meta move is the non-rational move in game theory dynamics that can get you through all of these rational impasses, these Nash equilibria and different things. But if you never think the meta move, you're in trouble, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like the ability to ask, am I afraid? Really, really is what you should be asking. Not the, can I prove I can do it? I'm going to prove I can do it in different things. And look, I guess the other thing I was going to say with polyamory is the possibility of a polyamorous society will be tenable to me when I find out my plumber does polyamory. When the guy who's doing the internet wires does. When the electricians are. When the elites are, I don't care. The idea of what is a sociologically possible horizon by which people can live their lives is not a question of what the rich or the privileged or the college educated are doing. No, that's always a minority. Yeah. And that's always a small percent. The question is, what is your plumber? And if polyamory is just as acceptable as monogamy, then one day there will be a world where some percentage of plumbers are polyamorous, because it is going to be the blue collar people, who are going to tell you what is tenable as a social order. Now, you could argue, well, hey, guess what? Robots and AI are going to, change all of that. Well, we'll see. Yeah. We'll see. Yeah. But I will say to them, and then I'll give it to you. It is, though, the monogamy people did contribute to this problem, though, because they did, out of pride, say, this is the right way to live, this is better than everything else, and then people are like, well, everyone's miserable, so so this is it's very clear the monogamy people have been jerks, and they've moralized it, and they haven't shown their defense of monogamy has not been, well, this is the place where we face the real, come to terms with our lack, and move like Dante toward the beautiful through a long process of tearing with negativity and learning how to have better qualities of repetition. Mm-hmm. That is not what monogamy people say. The monogamy people, they have no idea why they're in monogamy, truth be told. So one can understand why people are like, well, let's try something different because this ain't working. Exactly. So certainly, one should not blame the polyamorous for trying polyamorous, because the people who have done monogamy have not exactly represented it very well. Certainly,
no, it's a really important point.
So the pride of monogamy has been a massive source of this issue.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's wonderful. I guess I was just going to say too, because I could almost sense it be like, well, the reason why your plumber is not polyamorous at this point is because there hasn't been some sort of like great awakening for people, people haven't been able to overcome their jealousy, etc. And might be true. Who knows? Like you said, you'll know it when
when it happens.
But I think there's also I do wonder too if like say for example with jealousy, yeah, like, is jealousy wrong? Yeah, usually it is wrong, and it's a very bad place to act from, But it's interesting, too, because how do I put this? I think that, in general, it might be helpful to kind of, like with everything, if you're already going to complexify the unit of marital, marital units and how those can be structured and how family units can be structured, we may also want to think about, like, what is jealousy? Is it always wrong? Is it sometimes good? Mm-hmm. Is it not good? What is there about it that why does it exist for people? Like, I do think there's something problematic, because it can also show you lack trust in, say, your spouse or your partner, or even your friend. If you have a type of jealousy or a constant paranoia of like, oh, do you like other people more than me, or do you want other people more than me, or blah blah blah. Now, obviously, unfortunately, people do go off and have affairs, and they leave the person, and it's quite quite devastating. Why is it devastating? Is it just because jealousy is wrong? Like, is it wrong? It's like, well, it's almost more because they broke a commitment. It's they broke a promise. They didn't stand by somebody, and we, as humans, seem to value loyalty to some degree. You can question. I guess what I mean to say is, like, maybe you could get into what it is about being human that makes us have these certain propensities or reactions, right? And could we be like a more evolved species to not deal with jealousy? But then again, can we assume that would be entirely better to have like no sense of jealousy? Obviously the wisdom traditions had a sense that like God is jealous, for example.
Sure.
That was actually supposed to be a good thing because there was and it's strange to attribute a vice to like a perfect omnipotent being.
But that's very important, because I very much hesitate to defend emotions on the human side like righteous anger. We can talk about God as having righteous anger, but when you start about humans, there seems to be a lot of trouble, right?
Right.
Like there are possibilities of emotion for the divine that may be cut off from the human.
Yeah, but, like we can't relate to what that even means. Yeah, we can't relate to,
and in fact, if we think we can, that's pride. Just like you're trying to put yourself in a situation that maybe God can handle, but we can't, right? So there's a danger there. Now, at the same time, that doesn't invalidate the point you're making, because jealousy is very interesting in the sense of it's just like anger. It has similarity to anger, because you tend to get angry when you're jealous. You tend to have the social intelligibility is threatened, right? Often jealousy is fear. You're afraid of losing the person, so actually the medicine is courage
or whatever.
And so also you don't want them talking to other people because you're afraid, and usually that's tied to an insecurity. Jealousy and insecurity are tied together.
Yes, very much so.
And also too, I'm not sure if designing your life around overcoming jealousy is actually optimal. Like, you should be focusing on seeking the beautiful, which is more of a depth thing. And then it's like that takes care of jealousy.
Without it making it all about overcoming your, like we should just learn to be less jealous and therefore we could do polyamory.
Yeah, you have to decide what your main...
It's a good goal. Like, there's something that's kind of
actually
about that goal. But it's just like you said, the emphasis and the focus might divert you, unfortunately.
Classically, to treat a good goal as the highest goal is a vice. And that's a weird thing. I do think that we can treat overcoming jealousy as the highest goal, which actually then makes it a vice. Because actually the highest goal is to seek the beautiful. And if you actually create, this could be a thing that happens in polyamory, not that I'm saying it does, but if you say, okay, we're going to do polyamory to get the spiritual advancement of not being jealous. That actually can become a vice if that is not toward experiencing the beautiful. And one of the reasons why I would personally put my emphasis on monogamy is because approaching the beautiful is a matter of approaching depth, and the same thing over and over again, and tearing with that. It's not a thing. Beauty is not a thing of distance. And that being the case, focusing on not being a jealous person is actually not the right focus. You should focus on the beautiful, and then you don't think about the jealous because you're taken in the awe of the beautiful, right? And so to make a good goal, the highest goal is a vice. And so I think that happens with jealousy all the time, actually. I think jealousy is something that takes care of it. Because what's the difference between jealousy and awe? When you're in awe of a sunset, are you jealous of it? You kind of want to possess it. You want to behold it, and in a sense you want to possess it, but it's not the same kind of possessing as like having a diamond or something, right? So the beautiful has a certain fixedness on the beautiful, but it's the same as earlier. It's all just the order. You're fixed on the beautiful, which causes great change within you. Versus you're fixed on change, and so you're fixed inside as you move between things, like the wind, right? So likewise, the medicine for jealousy is focusing on the beautiful, but the beautiful is a product of negativity and lack and difficulty. So I think but look, this is, you could maybe argue here that one of the greatest causes of ITD, intellectually transmitted diseases, is treating good goals as the highest goals.
100%.
That might be the number one cause of them. Because...
And certainly is often the case for STDs, right? So
absolutely.
It's like an ITDs. So it just transfers over in that analogy.
Yeah, because in many friendships, all your trouble comes because your friends want you to have a good goal that's not the greatest goal. Your family does. They just want you to be happy.
They
just want you to be happy.
It's not a bad thing. That's the problem. It's a good thing. That's why it's hard to see it as like infectious or like causing something that then is latent.
Yeah, because it's a good goal. But the mistake is it's being treated as the highest
like,
goal.
Wait, but it's causing such dis-ease. Just to break that word down, it's like, okay, well, maybe...
That's good.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should slow down a little bit and think about if this good is the ultimate, like, if this is the good we should hold up as the goal, as the good, as the ultimate good, or not. You know what I mean? And it's just...
Well, it should also note that the reason why pride is tied to the lack of proportion is because you require proportion to identify what good goals are not the highest goal, right? Because you can purport them like, oh, this is a good goal, but it's not the highest goal. It's good in this proportion, but not the ultimate proportion, right? Mm-hmm. So there's something with pride is when you lose the ability to tell which good goals should be, third on the list versus first on the list, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you get disordered. And then you get a dis-ease. That's funny because when you're disordered, you're dis-eased. You do not have ease because you're out of order and such. You get a disease. So I like that.
Yeah. Oh well, I think it's been
fun. Yeah, so I'm glad we could talk about sexually transmitted diseases in the form of intellectual exchange. But no, I think a major source of intellectually transmitted diseases are in families and friends that are encouraging you to treat a good goal as the greatest goal. Mm-hmm. That have friends like, oh, well, you ought to try this, you ought to try that. Well, don't, it's good to date, different people. You have that advice, even though it's like, I think it's a bad person. It's like, well, you don't know, right? So it's like, well, yeah, it's good to experience new things, but it should not be the highest factor in the decision here.
Yeah,
right?
And that's where, like, even encountering negativity, I don't think can be the ultimate. It may, yes, you will encounter. Don't worry, you will. Occur, it will just occur in life. But it's like to make it the goal.
Yeah.
Well, it really skews your discernment, right? Because it's like, oh, well, like you're saying, if a friend's like, oh, well, you should just give it a try, like dating this person. Well, is it a bad person? Yeah. That negativity is not necessarily one you can. Exactly. You don't want to assume it's like going to necessarily make you a better person. It may not, but like you have to still have discernment,
Well, again, it's like people say, well, it was a bad experience, but I grew from it. Well, so are you looking for bad experiences to grow from there? Exactly. Because, in what way did you grow from it, right? Maybe you grew, there's such thing as cancerous growth, right? In a bad way. But that's why for me the emphasis is courage, right? Like courage as the highest thing, because the thing is you will and I think that's great too, because it's not to put down or avoid negativity, no, but it's also not to like hold it up as what you should be forcing, like kind of making yourself into it, because if you're not strong enough for it, it's like expecting you can deadlift 200 pounds. Like, have you literally done any weight training at all? Yes.
It's like don't expect that you can actually like get that be something you benefit from. Now, if you have to go through it because it's just a life situation you can't control, well, now you will need to be the person who learns how to get to deadlift 200 pounds. You have to learn how to.
Well, it's interesting.
You know what I mean? But it's like, I think that's why courage is so good, because it doesn't like vilify or deify negativity. It recognizes that it is an aspect of the human condition, and that if you are doing it, if you're going to be courageous, that's actually going to ultimately be something you would submit yourself to, because you know that it's something that will actually help you to become a better person.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because there is a way in which if you're afraid to do it, that almost inherently demands a sense that you need training. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're saying, I'm just going to intentionally go into negativity, there's no sense of the training you need to face the thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas there's an interesting way in which there's a grace in, there's a kind of grace in fear, because it says you need to prepare. Mm-hmm. You need to work yourself to the place where you can do this. Like, even if you're just like even just breath work is a kind of training, right? So it's kind of interesting to think of the reason why you should prioritize the negativity of fear is precisely what you fear says to you in that very fear. A certain preparedness is needed. Mm-hmm. A certain work is needed.
So practice of venturing out a little bit and a little
bit.
Which,
interesting enough, means it brings with it anti-pride. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're afraid, then there's not pride. Whereas I can easily see, I'm going to intentionally go into negativity being on the side of the lack of proportion, and ergo on the side of pride. But fear, it is hard for me to see facing fear as prideful. Because you have to acknowledge you're afraid, to face it, right? And now we've had these million discussions on the differences between like being afraid of a cliff and afraid of anxiety. So, there are those distinctions, and there's ways there, there's wisdom versus fear. But if we're actually talking of fear, there's a certain call to humility and pre-work to do the work, though. Because the other thing is when you fear something, it's saying there's now an imperative, like an ought. You ought to do the pre-work to be prepared to do this thing. Oh, yeah. So that's why there's a certain phenomenological quality to fear that makes it unique in what we should focus on versus negativity. Because negativity does not tell us necessarily that we need to face it and we need to prepare for it. Where fear brings those unique summons with it.
That's a great point. And I think too, really quick, the fear, also the reason why I think that can be helpful is because with genuine fear, it, and it's so hard to get yourself to do the thing you're afraid to do. Like it's really, really can be really quite hard. The things that you do and you're kind of like, it's almost, there's like this kind of niceness and self-sacrificial language, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, you're right. Maybe I should just give him a chance. Like he's not really a good guy, but I'll date him, Like, yeah, I should be willing to have new experiences. And like, you're kind of saying that like, I don't care what happens to me or to them, but I should do it for the sake of giving it a try, trying something out. But you know what, there's an impulsivity at the heart of that kind of, you just kind of want to do, you're kind of itching to do it. No, fear is the opposite. You're not itching to do this thing. Like not at all. Exactly. Like you're like, you can barely get yourself to do it. Whereas the other, you're like kind of just like, you got like, it's like, it's almost like you're, there's an expression, but basically just like you're reared up to do it. Yeah. And it almost just talking to your friend is just getting that affirmation.
Yes. That's it. It's a disguise of wisdom seeking, but really
maybe you
affirmation.
Didn't seek out your friend's advice. Maybe they just told you to, and this, going back to the ITD. But I think what's interesting too, just like with STDs, there's such a mutuality.
Yes.
These things often come out of this strange dynamic too of people seeking out affirmation because they don't want to take responsibility for their decision. Exactly. And so that's another strange dimension to it, and why we need to be kind of more on our guard,
But there's
about what we also petition from other people, because we might be kind of inviting an ITD because we're like, it feels better that way than me just deciding.
Well, getting an STD is pleasurable. Yeah. That's the problem. But you're bringing in why affirmation is so dangerous.
Yeah.
Like, affirmation as a principle desperately needs to be critiqued, because affirmation tends to be a very strong vehicle of ITD. Because affirmation, very, very rarely do people seek affirmation to face a fear. They seek affirmation to avoid a fear or 100%. To do something they want to do. Like, usually when you don't look for someone to affirm you in a fear. You look for affirmation to do something you kind of sense you shouldn't do, or you think something is off and you're anxious, right? Now, anxious sounds like fear, but it's actually anxious in the sense of there's a break between what I want and what is, and that's off, and I want to know that, I'm right. Because the word affirmation has to mean you're right. Like, why do you want affirmation? To be right. Well, you're risking pride then. You're risking... Rather than letting the situation give its proportionality to you, you've already decided the right relation, and you just want to be affirmed in it. Now, it depends.
Sure.
It depends on what you mean, but very often, affirmation becomes a good goal that is moved to the place of highest goal, and then it becomes a vice, right? Yeah. And so... I think also, like, with the negativity stuff, like... I think basically, like, a very, very high amount of, the ITDs that happen in family are basically facing negativities, but not facing fears. Like, hey, I'm telling you, where families have tough talks, quote unquote. And it's negative, and we're doing the hard... Like, people talk all the time about doing... I
really don't want to say this.
Yes, right. Of course. But, actually, you'd love to say it, but it's hard. You see people, I'm doing the hard thing, therefore it's good, right? You hear that all the time. Or I'm doing the
hard thing, so I'm facing a fear.
Yeah, that's what they assume, right? That's the movement. It's like, just because it's facing hard things is a good thing, but it's not the highest thing, because there are many hard things that are not good to face. That just create trouble, right?
No, I guess I've never thought about that, too, when somebody says that. It may be, I'm not saying it is necessarily, but it can be a red herring for they actually want to say it.
Yes. Absolutely.
It's hard because they don't know if they're going to be understood or if the person's going to agree with them.
It's hard because once they say it can't be unsaid and they have to take responsibility for it. They're confusing the hardness of facing a fear with the hardness of taking responsibility or putting something in the air. But the thing they want to put in the air is something they want to say, but what they want to say they don't want responsibility for. That's something that humans are famous for.
Yeah.
Of wanting to do things we're not... Yeah.
Well, in a way, it's almost better not to preface with, like, it's really hard for me to say this, because it's like...
Because that's...
I mean, I don't know, maybe it's human. Maybe it's just like in that moment you're kind of flailing to be like, this is hard to say, but
you're
I think
avoiding...
it's
When you say that, you're Well, this is interesting because I think humans, instead of pre-thought, we do pre-moves to frame ourselves in the best light versus to see the frame in which we see ourselves. Like, often when people say, this is hard for me to say, they're saying, I'm the victim here. Now, I'm about to say something that's really hurtful and painful and terrible, but I'm the victim here. So it's a pre-move to put yourself in the best light. You're controlling the frame versus seeing the frame to know what's best regardless what you want.
Well, and I also think there's a difference between, because depending on the content of what somebody's saying, I can understand and I can relate to being afraid to speak because you're like, oh my gosh, I'm exposing something. It's vulnerable. Like I'm exposing something about myself. Or I'm ashamed.
But should you
whatever.
say,
but it's
I'm
not
afraid.
Yourself.
Yeah,
like you're not saying I'm afraid to tell you because I'm going to tell you should do something different. It's like I'm afraid to tell you because this feels horrible. Like I don't like having to expose whatever. As something that just makes you feel like very ashamed. So it's like I think that. Yeah, I mean, I mean, there can be an element in which it can feel hard to do like proper confrontation, right? Sure. Where it's like, hey, I should probably talk with you about this before I don't, and I grow resentful, and that's not healthy either, right? But maybe just not prefacing it with like, because it's like we all know it's kind of hard to do those things. It's not easy. So just to say it's hard, but then especially if it's about like
show don't tell. I mean, this is where the skills of the artist are important because an artist knows you're not supposed to have a character, but I am sad.
Maybe somebody would also say that because they're like, hopefully if you hear that this is hard for me to say, you're not just taking it as criticism. You're taking it as maybe there's some underlying truth here.
But this is again the skill of an artist, because if there's underlying truth, you should be able to articulate in a way where that is shown.
Like you don't have to preface it with this is
not
hard
at all.
To say.
Because but this is what people do, that kind of thing when you have a society that is not trained in speaking or in oration, where we don't know how to be articulate. So we have to pour in from the top. It's basically bad dialogue. And art, bad dialogue is bad dialogue. There are reasons that people do it, but it's still bad. Yeah. Like the artists in their story, there was a reason they had the characters say the bad dialogue, but the bad dialogue breaks the story, right? Like if what you are saying is true, then the saying of it will show the truth.
And that's where I feel too. It's like, that's probably going to be the best bet you have is to let truth speak for itself.
But if you don't know how to write, if you don't know how to speak, then that doesn't seem to be an option to you.
And sometimes too, it's like, is this hard, or would it be harder for you to live with this and not speak? Like, I think that's the other thing where people may not calculate it. It's like, there's always this assumption that, well, the hard and the right thing to do is to speak it.
Yes. Not necessarily
maybe, but
at all.
Maybe not. Like sometimes there's things you're like, wow, it is hard to not bring this up, but at the same time, I realize that actually my motivation for bringing that up is because I have a certain understanding of this situation that might not actually be the case.
But what you're getting at, it's so
particular.
It's all to the point that negativity is not the best heuristic. It's courage, and then of course, but this is why being human is hard, is telling the difference between the facing fear and fear of not getting your way. Like that's, those are what often when people say it's hard for me to say, they're afraid that things won't go the way they want it to go, so they're going to speak up to make sure it goes that way. That's very different than the fear of facing something that you don't want to face. The fear of losing control is different from the fear of facing Lovecraft or facing the negativity of the human experience. But those are subtle differences that, frickin' ITDs ain't helping with. And also, too, you're probably not getting those those subtle differences correctly if you are catching intellectually transmitted diseases, right? A culture and world of ITDs is going to be one that doesn't have these intellectual distinctions. In the same way, it's probably a pretty good bet that a world full of sexually transmitted diseases is lacking intimacy, or lacking stable families, or lacking, environments that raise children well, right? Like if 90%, just theoretically, if 90% of people had STDs, it would be a pretty good bet that it would be an unstable society, right? So likewise, if 90% of people have intellectually transmitted diseases, this is probably a society where people can't tell subtle differences between emotions and ideas and motives, and therefore it's probably in massive disarray. And unfortunately, it easily could be the case that 90% of people have ITDs, probably given the rate of intellectual exchange. Because basically with internet, cell phones, talking, it's like you're constantly having sex in the intellectual realm.
Yeah.
Perpetually.
Yeah.
So it's basically very probable, given that much intellectual sex, that you have an ITD. Yeah. Just very likely. And so it is probably the case that 90 to however percent have ITDs. And therefore, it is probably the case that very, 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 very few people can tell the differences between these motivations or even think the difference. And that probably means there are very few people who can teach it. It's probably not in the institution, so the problem of ITDs is very likely to get worse and worse and worse. But it's precisely in the failure and the suffering and negativity that then brings about that then, as a kind of Dante grace, makes people go, is this it?
Yeah.
And the very ability to ask, is this it, becomes the basis of hope.
Yeah.
And this is it for this episode of OG Rose.
Yeah.
So we've enjoyed talking today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, thank you.
For more, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so on. And our books are on Amazon. We recently released Under the Wings short story collection. We would love to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.